Hey, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Since we're live streaming, we feel a need to be on time. So we're so glad you're here. We're talking today about navigating the role of a caregiver as an at-risk or gene-positive individual. So I'm Madeline Broyles. I'm the licensed clinical social worker for the Rocky Mountain chapter, which is based out of Denver, Colorado.
Good morning, and I am Courtney Gatza. I am the Center of Excellence social worker at Indiana University in Indiana.
So we're so glad you guys are here this morning. So we're going to start today by just talking a little bit. So obviously the information provided by us is not necessarily it's just for informational use only, right? We are not official, we're just social workers. So, and then at the end, we'll put this back up, but you're welcome to scan this and give us your feedback. Let us know what you thought about the presentation, the topic, whatever you want to share. So we're going to start with some stories. So I think one of the things about coming to something like this, just the convention in general, is to connect with others, right? Like, you want to know that you're not the only one dealing with this thing. And so I run a lot of support groups. And so as I was running my support groups the last couple months after I got my topic for this convention, I asked my attendees, what's your experience? What are your stories? What do you guys see as this? So to me, the definition of who should be here is really anyone that feels like they're caregiving for somebody. Because I had one of my guys in my support group, he said, I didn't ever take care of my dad. My mom did. And I said, yeah, but did you support your mom? Did you ever call your dad? Did you see your dad after he became symptomatic? He goes, well, yeah. And I said, well, then you're a caregiver, right? So one of the other things that this gentleman shared with me was that there was a lot of pressure to visit the nursing home as a kid, right? He remembers his dad kind of being uncomfortable around his symptomatic parents, and just a lot of guilt about his dad not doing enough, right? So some of you might be experiencing that a little bit. I think another client of mine shared that he grew up in a ranch-style home that could accommodate his dad's mobility. They had a lot of big hallways, big doorways, and that was just normal for their family. Other people shared, watching relatives and seeing their concern about what was going to happen to them, and then sort of feeling like being a burden on their caregivers, right? And worrying about being a burden yourself on the people that are caring for you. Another shared that his sister actually became symptomatic in her late 30s and went into a nursing home about the same time that his dad did. And so he watched both his sister and his dad pass away before he was even symptomatic. And he just kind of kept thinking, well, when is this going to happen to me? Like, that's my sister, right? It should all be the same. Another gal talked about how, when her dad went into a nursing home, she kept thinking, is that what I'm going to be like? Is that what's going to happen, right? And I think whether or not we know our status or we're worried about our status, right, we're going to have some of those similar questions, like, is this what it's going to be like for me? So being an at-risk or gene-positive caregiver has really specific challenges. It's not like being a caregiver in general. I think if you're married to someone with Huntington's and you're caregiving for them, that's a really different set of issues than if you yourself are also at risk. So some of the main fears are fear of becoming like my parent or the person that I'm caring for. Like seeing that every day and knowing like, oh, this is something that I'm at risk for, right? And then sort of having to come to terms with your own relationship with Huntington's, right? This is personal to you, even though this is about these other people as well. Like, you have your own relationship with the disease. And then managing those big feelings. And notice I put big in all capitals just to shout that out there. So I think, fear of being a burden, seeing what's happened to your grandparents and your parents, seeing how your parents are reacting to their parents, right? And then feeling like, oh, that's going to happen to me. And so it's like, what do I do? How do I kind of move past that? So, sorry, I'm navigating two machines. I didn't have any paper, so I just wrote my notes down on my laptop and brought it too. So, okay, so a fear of becoming like the one I am taking care of is a real thing, right? I think when you're seeing it, whether it's occasional or every day, when it's really present for you, there is kind of that, well, that's going to be me, isn't it? And what's that going to look like, and how's that going to feel? And, oh, this is so hard for me, so it's going to be hard for the people taking care of me. And, and I think that it's something that we really have to sort of step back and, just sort of recognize, like, it's not anything I can control, right? This isn't something you have a choice about, like, but the fear is real. And I think it's just something that, like, sometimes we have to say, wow, there's a lot of fear there. Like, I have no idea what's going to happen. And that's a real thing, right? And that real fear doesn't have to be present all the time. I think, we're going to talk some more about that. So the next one is denial okay. I loved the road to denial sign because, you know what? A survey says yes. Are you guys shocked? I literally, every support group I had, about 50% of the people said, well, my biggest coping skill was denial. And I'm like, well, how did that work for you? Great. And I was like, really? Tell me more. Help me understand, well, I just thought it's not going to be like this for me. Right. But what's interesting is, I think in talking with other social workers and like looking at other people, and caregivers that are managing their own gene status, it was amazing to hear how many people use denial as a skill, like really a skill. And I think the most important thing to remember is at some point, to keep it a skill, it has to end, right? So we can only stay in denial. There has to be a time limit for it, just like any other coping skill, right? Coping skills have time limits. They're intentional. They're on purpose. And we say, okay, I'm intentionally going to do this thing for this certain amount of time, and then I'm going to let that change, right? And I think that's the biggest difference here is denial okay for a little while? Yeah. And maybe that's what's going to help you get through this period of time or these events or whatever it is, right? But at some point, we can't sit in denial, because then if we're still in denial, then it actually leads into problems about our own care, right? So that's where we have to sort of set some limits. So identifying and overcoming anticipations. So just like when you get married, you have a set of expectations that may or may not be met, right? I don't know about anybody else in this room, but when I got married, I thought my husband was a certain way, and about a year later, I was like, oh my gosh. And it wasn't all bad. In fact, there are some great things. Like there were things about my husband that I didn't know that ended up like making us an even better fit, right? But there were also some things that I was like, oh, I don't know about that one, And I think as transparent as we both tried to be with each other, we can't know everything, right? And so as we look at sort of what is it that I'm expecting, right? What am I anticipating? Like, what am I worried about? Like, some of that may never, ever happen to us. That may not even be a concern, right? And especially those that are younger, the research is out there is already just moving forward so fast. There's so many awesome things happening. And I think, well, how do you know? How do you know this is really going to be what's going to happen? You just don't. Those who are still at risk and haven't been tested, you don't know, right? And so it's like those anticipations that we build up, sometimes they're not going to be met at all. And I think sometimes the positive anticipations as well, right? So I didn't get married till I was 40. And so when my nephew was really little, his name's Cameron, I say, Cameron, when you get old, you're going to call Aunt Madeline every day and see what she needs, aren't you? And he's like, okay. So I was ready. I wanted to program somebody to take care of me as I aged, right? And, but I think now, like, things changed for me. I ended up marrying someone who had kids, and so I have all these great stepkids who love me, and I thought, oh, I don't have to have Cameron call me anymore. Now I'm going to make Kinley do it, right? And so my expectations and my anticipations of that have changed. And, and I think that happens to all of us. Things happen, and we just, we move forward with it, and then we're like, oh, that thing I was worried about for 10 years isn't even applicable anymore. So coming to terms with one's own self, I would put a dog in this picture, but I think some self-reflection and some time to really investigate my own, who am I, like, outside of this, and prioritizing your own grief. So one of the gentlemen in a support group that I run shared that his dad was diagnosed with HD when he was 16, and he chose to be tested when he was 18. So just 2 years later, and got a positive test. And he said, I never grieved for myself. He's like, I was so caught up in my dad's grief and in grieving over my parent and just everything. He's like, I didn't really take the opportunity to sort of separate my own experience and be like, oh, wait, what about me? And I think it's really important that we do sort of take some time for ourselves separately, really to, like, step back and look at, like, meeting our own needs, right? Prioritizing our own grief, like, and whatever we're grieving for, right? Maybe we're grieving for the connection with our parent. Maybe we're, grieving that Huntington's is in our family, that our siblings are at risk, like, maybe that your aunt and uncle are symptomatic, like, whatever it is, right? And I think just really stepping back and, like, sort of sitting with it and being like, oh, what's about me? What's about someone else? Where do I have control? Why am I feeling so sad all the time? Well, I have a lot of reasons to feel sad. Oh, that feels good. Sometimes just kind of validating our own feelings and really giving ourselves some time to sit with things. I don't know how many of you are busy, but I'm a very busy person. And I had a friend ask me a couple months ago, she said, do you ever just sit around in silence? And I was like, no, but then I thought, no, actually I do. I have my morning reflection time, and I was like, oh yeah, that is that sitting, and so I think it's important that we all do this, that we have some time, that we kind of come to terms with ourselves, that we really look at, like, who we are, where we're going, what we want, what we're happy about, what we're sad about, what we're worried about, what we can do about it, right? Those things are important. So recognizing the difference. This is one I know everyone's heard, but I just wanted to put it back out there. Every individual with Huntington's is just that, an individual, right? I was doing a training for a nursing home, and I got in there, and they had an individual with Huntington's beforehand, and he had passed, and he was actually quite well known in our community. I think he'd been the chapter president or something, and I didn't know him. He passed before I came in, but I'd heard a little bit about him, and so they were like, oh, he was just great, and that's why we took this other person. Well, this next person that they took had a lot of really different challenges. Like, she was actually very mobile, and her chorea was not as significant, but she had a lot of compulsive behaviors. And so I think the staff were kind of more ready for this other person who'd been in a wheelchair due to a lot of chorea. And it was interesting, though, as I was training them, I talked to them about chorea, and they said, oh, well, that's so weird, because the guy that was here before was really nice, but he would hit you all the time. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. I said, he wasn't hitting you. I said, that was just his chorea. And they said, yeah, we just couldn't figure out why he'd be so nice and then slap you. And but then with this new client, they didn't have any of those problems, but she had to have some restrictions on towels and toilet paper and things, that they didn't anticipate. And I think, we really can't know, even within our family, right? Symptoms of the disease vary significantly from immediate family members, right? Look at my client whose sister passed before he even found out that he was gene positive, right? And I mean, they're not that far apart in age. So, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, you just don't know. You don't know what's going to happen. And so you are not the same as the person you're caring for. Just because I talk like my mother or look like my mother does not make me my mother, right? I tell people that all the time. Oh, you're just like your mom. I'm like, no, I'm not, really, I was like, we are our own people, and this is your own experience, and I think it's really important to remember that. Managing big feelings. So Courtney's going to talk about some of this a little bit later too, but I think one of the things about feelings is they can be really sneaky, right? Sometimes they are physical discomfort in the body, and we don't even recognize it as a feeling. So I always kind of look at anger as the signal fire. And I tell my clients this a lot. I'm like, if you're angry, it's because you've been ignoring a smaller feeling that needs your attention, right? And so what you need to do is you need to go in and calm the anger and breathe into it and find out what is the feeling in there. It's going to usually be fear, right? Or sadness. And I said, go find the real feeling and then let's address that. Because anger is usually a signal fire. It's usually there to help us listen to our body. And guess what happens when you ignore it? Kind of like any fire, it gets out of control, right? So when you're getting like really big emotions and they're just, take a look deeper. Don't go with anger, go with what's underneath. Sadness, guilt, fear, shame, something like that, right? Go and sort through those feelings and really figure out what's going on for you and give it your attention, because it will help bring down that anger fire. I always tell people, if you address an emotion quicker, it doesn't have to get as strong because it knows that you're paying attention, right? And our feelings are just that. They're feelings. They're signals. They're information, right? We don't have to act on every feeling we have. We don't have to be consumed by every feeling we have. Sometimes we can allow ourselves to be consumed by it for a short period of time, right? Once again, we want to have intention and a time limit. But, I think recognizing how do we manage our big feelings is really about just that, like looking at our feelings, seeing them for what they are, acknowledging them, and identifying the real feeling underneath, right? So, determining how and when to ask for help. I think this one is really important because I think a lot of us don't ask for help until we need it. And guess what? By the time we need it, now it's a crisis and an emergency, right? This one's really tricky for me. I had a social worker tell me that she had just barely been reached out to by somebody who his long-term care was ending and he'd never applied for SSDI or Medicaid or Medicare or anything. And what was she supposed to do to help him? And I said, whoa, there's things you can do, absolutely, but it's going to take some time, right? And she said, yeah, but he doesn't have time. So, we kind of talked about, well, here's how to address it quicker and, get through it. I think sometimes that pre-planning stage is really important, right? So even if I'm not sure that I'm going to have the disease, I can plan for what I might have, right? So even me, I'm a social worker, I'm not at risk, but I might be at risk for something else, right? And I talked to my husband about it, and I was like, if I got in a car accident and became a vegetable, go ahead and pull the plug, right? I went to the Conversation Project. We had them come and present in my area for one of our Food for Thoughts, and it was excellent. And it really made me think a lot about, we all need to plan, no matter where we're at. We need to have a plan. We need to have those conversations, right? We need to be talking about it. I think a lot of times, too, as a caregiver, we feel like, well, I'm the one that chose this, that chose to stay, that chose to be here, that chose not to go to college, that, whatever, said I would take care of my mom, and so I have to do it all by myself, right? Guess what? You don't. You don't have to do it alone. Burnout is a real thing. As a social worker, burnout is something we talk about all the time. You go to a whole conference about not burning out, right? How do you manage things? There's all these workshops you can pay money for about not burning out, right? So I get burnout. And the thing about burnout is, as a caregiver, burnout is really easy. It's really easy to just go and go and go and overdo it and burn out. And then what do you do, and what do you do with the person you're caring for? Right? It's so important that we ask for help and that we kind of figure out when. One of my clients recommended a big family meeting. He said, when you're all pitching in on this decision and you're talking to so-and-so and so-and-so and so, and he's like, just get everybody together. He's like, let everybody voice their opinions, have a big meeting, make a decision. And then when Aunt Tilda calls and says, I was thinking maybe, and he's like, no, we already made the decision. Sorry, can't. Right? And I think that's so important to stick with it, right? Like, get everyone together, let everyone say their piece, make your decision, and then move forward. And then also, sometimes letting go. I had another client share with me that his mom had cared for his dad up until the end of his life, and that he was on hospice and definitely struggling, and his mom was spoon feeding his dad to keep him alive longer. And he went home for a visit, and he just said, Mom, it's okay to stop. It's okay to let him go. I mean, he's ready to go, and it took him, he shared, that it took him telling his mom that for her to let go of that guilt around it and to go ahead and let him go, And I think sometimes, that is what it takes. Like, just having someone else step in and help you see that you've met that boundary, and that you don't have to keep pushing it, right? And having that conversation. So part of the conversation project that I really loved was she shared some statistics, and she said, basically, if you have a conversation about end-of-life desires and intentions with somebody, as a caregiver, after that person passes, your guilt decreases significantly after 3 months compared to someone that hadn't had that conversation. And I was like, wow. I mean, that's awesome. The percentage was like 50 to 80% better response after 3 months than someone who hadn't had a conversation about it, which is why I immediately went home and told my husband he could pull life support on me, right, if I got in a car accident. I was like, let's have this conversation, because I don't want you to have any guilt, right? I want you to, if something were to happen, I want it to be okay, right? And I think it's really important to have those conversations and identify those with the person you're caring for, and maybe about yourself as well, right? Because we never know what could happen. So, and then how could this be easier? I thought this was an awesome picture. He's got a Christmas tree in his bike basket. Sometimes that's the only way we can do it, right? I thought it was very innovative. But what parts of caregiving could be made easier by the person you care for? And what are some considerations for the future? I think there are times when we think something's going to be a certain way, and then it's just not that way, and we have to change it. We have to become innovative and put the Christmas tree in our bike basket, right? So I saw this video on YouTube the other day of this guy at the grocery store. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's some lady that posts a lot, and so she and her husband are sitting in this car in the parking lot, and this guy has like 12 grocery bags and a watermelon, and he has a scooter, right, like an electric scooter, and he straps on this like utility vest with hooks all over it and this belt, and he hooks all of the bags all over his entire body, and he puts the watermelon in a baby carrier, and he gets on this scooter, and he's probably got 50 pounds of food on him, right, and he drives away, and I just thought, wow, okay, I probably would have called a friend and been like, I got to go to the grocery store. Could you take me in your car? But and he's told them, because he saw him watching him and filming him. And so he like kind of, they're like, oh, he's like, are you filming me? They're like, yeah. He's like, you're going to post it online? They're like, probably, and they're like, how often do you do this? He said, every week. So every week he goes to the grocery store, and he had it down. Like, he was balanced. The watermelon baby carrier thing, I was like, holy cow, right? So, we can get creative, right? It doesn't have to be a certain way. We can figure things out. And I think that it's really important as we kind of think about what are our considerations, right? How can we sort of make things easier for ourselves, for those around us, right? And then insight and reflection. Having access to reflection and insight of what you've experienced, and being open to the insight of others. This is something that I think about a lot, because as a social worker, We do a lot of surveys. Anybody done a social worker's survey before? Right? And anytime my chapter needs a survey, they're like, Madeline, could you create a survey? I'm like, of course, right? I am all about insight and reflection. And I think that that's, kind of one of the things that is important, that we do that for ourselves, right? Maybe we step back and we evaluate, like, how well am I doing? How is this going for me? How, at what point do I need some help or some care or some support, right? And, and also sort of asking others, like, what do you see, right? Because sometimes I can't see it. Sometimes I'm too close to it to really even have an idea of what to do. I had a client that we were talking, and they're at risk. They're gene positive actually, but pre-symptomatic. And we were talking about something, and I said, that sounds like a lot of anxiety to me. Oh, really? I was like, yeah. And they were like, oh, never thought about it like that. And they're like, well, what could I do about it? I said, well, with Huntington's, I would recommend talking to your doctor about some anxiety medication. And they were like, oh, and they got on some. And a couple months later, they said, I am feeling so much better. I was like, that is awesome, right? But sometimes we don't even see it for what it is until we have that experience of talking to someone else that helps us recognize it, right? I don't know if anybody's ever done something like that. So I have a funny joke that I read online about a caregiver. So this young man, his mom was getting older, and he'd been taking care of her at home, and it had gotten too difficult. And so he checked her into a nursing home. And so she went to the nursing home, and she had lunch, and he left. And so she, was sitting there in her chair, and during Matlock, she kind of leaned all the way to the right, and they came over and they sat her back up, and she was like, okay. So then, during Golden Girls, she like leaned over to the right, and they came and they sat her back up, and the next show comes on, and she leans over to the right, and they come and set her back up, and so the young man comes back the next day, and he's like, so Mom, what do you think? And she said, well, the food's good, but they won't let you fart. And I thought, sometimes we don't understand why someone's doing what they're doing, right? This was an important need, right? This woman needed to lean to the right, and they wouldn't let her, And so, so I think as caregivers, sometimes we need to ask. We need to get that reflection from somebody else, that insight from outside, to sort of help us understand, or maybe even talking to the person we're caregiving for to help us understand, like, what's going on, what's real, and to have kind of those experiences that we need. So I'm going to turn some time over to Courtney.
You guys, Madeline has slides of Christmas trees and jokes, and then I come up with a slide that starts, what is identity? Just a small question. I want to just kind of echo what Madeline had said at the beginning about how we think of being identified as a caregiver. I think sometimes we get caught up in caregiving being like a physical verb, right? It means like we're doing something for other people. But I just want to make sure that we're all thinking about it as like being a caregiver is also sometimes just an emotional investment in somebody that we love, right? We may not be in proximity the one every day providing physical care, but we're certainly invested in the well-being of our loved one, and that too makes us a caregiver. So I'm hoping for a little crowd participation here because, we have this topic for our presentation, and the thing that came to mind is, in the time that I spend working with caregivers, I run a lot of caregiver support groups and in clinic and whatnot, there's kind of this overwhelming sense of how much being a caregiver becomes an identity, right? It's a hat that we wear, and sometimes we wear it full time. So I'm curious from others, what you think of when you think of the word identity. Is there anything that anyone feels comfortable or willing to share as far as, a large umbrella, what identity means to you? I know we're before lunch and maybe coffee is wearing off. So, yeah.
I was just going to say.
Yeah, so we had someone say that the first thing that came to mind was actually identifying as a caregiver. Yeah.
I was going to say, it's sometimes kind of limiting. This is what I am. That's all.
Yeah. So identity can maybe be like a limiting identity, right? Like we think of it as just maybe one thing. And I think the thing that came to mind for me was to maybe broaden our scope of how we think about identity, right? Like identity can be us as a professional. It can be who we are in relationship to others, right? Like I'm a daughter, I'm a sibling, I'm a parent, I'm a partner, right? It could be our hobbies, right? I'm a knitter, I'm a crafter, I'm an athlete, you know. It could be your profession. I don't know if I said that. So we want to kind of think about identity as more than just that one thing that we do that comes to mind. And these were some definitions that I came up with. And I thought the second one really stuck with me, and I should have known psychology today would give us a good one. But identity encompasses the memories, experiences, relationships, and values that create one sense of self. And I really liked that because I think so much of it is true, right? You know, those memories and those experiences certainly play into who we are and our identity. So I think when we're talking about being caregivers and, you know, our gene status and things like that, those are certainly part of our identity. And the thing that I'm going to be focusing on for my portion is how do we make sure that those parts of our identity fit into this larger puzzle, right? So really trying to reframe thinking of identity as being one thing and to kind of reminding ourselves that who we are is actually much more complex than that one thing. And that we need those pieces to fit together. So caregiving and how that can be a piece of our identity puzzle. So I think Madeline had said something in her presentation that, like, you know, sometimes it's a choice, right? We choose to stay home, we choose to be involved in these certain capacities. But something I think that, you know, I've become aware of over time in working with the community is sometimes it's not a choice, right? Sometimes it's like, if not me, who else? And so sometimes we get put into this role, and it becomes our identity without our acknowledgement, and maybe without our desire for that to be a piece of our puzzle.
You nailed it.
Yeah. And so the thing that I really try to focus on, especially in support groups and things like that, is thinking, how can we keep space for the pieces that existed before this piece was handed to us? And I promise these are things we're going to think about, but Madeline and I hopefully have some things that we're going to leave you with today too, to kind of hopefully help answer that question. And then the last thing I have on here is creating space to acknowledge that dynamics and relationship changes. When we take this piece as part of our puzzle, that might mean that our relationship with the person that we love is becoming something different, right? And I'm definitely going to talk about feelings. And so I think like the feelings that can create, being open to acknowledging those. So specifically when we're thinking about this topic of being a caregiver and having this, you know, either knowing our gene status or not, sometimes that can create like a conflict in these parts that we're playing. And I think Madeline spoke to that nicely, that sometimes there's a lot of fear, right? Like, am I going to become the person that I love? And just having an awareness and openness to those things can exist, and they can be okay to feel that way. Oftentimes, there's not really a linear path into how these roles are going to play out, right? Kind of that expectation and perspective, you know, scope of things. We may think we know what way this road is going, and then all of a sudden it takes that sudden shift when it's dark out, and we weren't ready for that. So sometimes that can happen. And then lastly, our feelings will likely change over time, and sometimes they'll change, you know, within the same day. One minute we could feel like the day started out really, you know, it was a really good day, things were going well, and then maybe something comes up internally and it triggers something for us that we weren't expecting. I have this in here because, again, you know, I just think of the caregivers that I have the privilege to know and share how they're coping with things. And the thing that I hear most often becomes a lot of guilt. I think there's a lot of guilt in feeling that sometimes there's the feeling that, like, I'm angry, right? I'm stressed, I'm frustrated. I maybe have these negative feelings, and I feel bad for feeling that way because my loved one didn't ask for what they're experiencing, right? And what I try to challenge is to allow those negative feelings and allow that guilt to be okay, right? Like the whole, in thinking of this puzzle, right? This is just a piece of who we are, and when we feel those ways, sometimes those other pieces are getting neglected. And so sometimes we maybe need to call a timeout so that we can reflect on those pieces that aren't getting our attention and maybe really need it. So I just want us to be mindful that sometimes, you can feel both of these things. And I thought this image was really beautiful, the being able, feeling no shame and feeling both of these things. You can feel joy and you can feel grief. You can be grateful, but also be longing, right? And I think that these are feelings that we probably recognize when they're in writing like this. Like, this is probably like, oh yeah, like that hits for me. That is how I feel. But sometimes in the moment, it may be a stronger feeling of something like anger or something like guilt. So trying to be open. And then I wanted to just call attention to sometimes, like in our experience, we can feel great about something. We can feel really positive about what's going on. And if you can, bring some mindfulness to, is there something that created that feeling for you? And then if you're having a hard day, can you recreate that feeling by remembering what triggered it for you? And then on the flip side of that, if you're feeling a negative feeling, is there something that triggered that for you? And in the future, can that be avoided? Maybe it can't. But knowing, what triggered it can help bring an awareness to it so that when that happens again, you can approach it differently and maybe just allow space for it to exist. Oh gosh, I got to my ice cream slide very quickly. Does anybody have any comments or any additional kind of things to add to that portion? You can thank Madeline for an ice cream slide. She did great with her images. So we wanted to go into offering some skills and strategies because, we talk about these things, and I think it's really easy to be like, yeah, you hit the nail on the head with that, right? So like, what do I do about it? So this slide is just a reminder that like, we can drop our ice cream cone and we can have something bad going on, but we can fix it, right? We can go back to the counter and get a new cone. So we're hopefully going to offer some tools to kind of build back up so you can enjoy that cone. So this, I feel like this is such a big one. So I'm thinking of my caregivers, and in every group, there's always the question of what do I do about this? Or like, I did this, I don't know if it was right. How many people, if you're a caregiver, have said, I don't know if that's what I should have done. I don't know if that was the right thing to do. Can I tell you, you're never gonna know the answer before you make the choice. And the biggest thing I can say is, if you can remind yourself that the choices that you're making, the intention of those, if they come from a good place and they're coming from love, we never know the outcome sometimes, right? Like, hindsight, we're grateful for you, but sometimes, man, if you could have just come along beforehand. So just remind yourself that when you're making difficult decisions and you're feeling that pressure of like, is this the right thing for my person? Like, just be mindful of where you're making that decision from. And on the flip side of that, I want to offer that we put that much attention into our own quality of life, right? So again, in different moments of these experiences, that caregiver piece of the puzzle or that gene status piece of the puzzle, it can get really big, but it's not going to fit into our puzzle if we let it stay that size, right? So are there ways that you can get back to those other pieces of your identity, right? How can I find time to participate in things that are important to me and that make me who I am? And these don't have to be like multiple hours in a day. Maybe we need to start like super small, but we need to make sure that we have those experiences and those reminders of the things that make us us. So some strategies that I feel like we talk a lot about in our groups is that connection with others. So being intentional about finding time to connect with the people who are our people. And honestly, again, maybe another question for caregivers, how many caregivers have found that those people change once you become a caregiver and your time's spent focused on that? So, I'm actually thinking of times when people have expressed their anger, that the people that they thought were gonna be their people and there for them when they needed them weren't able to do that. And in those times, I think it's important to acknowledge that anger is usually, a sign of something else going on, right? Is there disappointment that the people you thought you could lean on maybe aren't able to support you in that moment? And that can be okay. Sometimes we have to grieve that those relationships aren't what we hoped they would be. But maybe we can try to find that connection with others, and sometimes it may be somebody that you didn't expect. Find ways to remain an active participant in your own life. I think that's such a huge one. Again, I hear so often from caregivers, and it's, the work that you do as a caregiver is beautiful, and it is the resiliency that, we just see so often in this community. But it is so important to make sure that you have an opportunity to participate in your own life. Maintain a safe space. So what I mean by this, I think it might be from a podcast that I listened to from somebody in the HD community. And they had said that they made their bedroom be a space that had nothing related to Huntington's disease in it. So that when they became overwhelmed, they knew that they could go to their bedroom and there was nothing there to force them to think about Huntington's disease. Yeah, and I thought that was really beautiful. So it may not be your bedroom, but if there's a space, and maybe it's just like an internal mental space that you can create for yourself, and maybe it's just intentional time to say, listen, I'm gonna go for a 30-minute walk, and in that time, I'm not gonna think about this, right? I'm gonna think about these other things that make me me. Scheduling intentional breaks, this kind of goes along with this and what I said before. If you are maybe feeling, the role of caregiver on your own, I hear a lot of time, I actually had somebody just say like, yeah, I got friends telling me to like take time for myself, and they're like, so are you gonna come over and give me an hour? And I was like, yeah, I get that, right? Like it's easy to say schedule intentional breaks and take time for yourself. And maybe just framing it as small amounts of time. Sometimes I think our own fear of like what's gonna happen if I'm not here keeps us in the room. And if we can just practice small breaks away, that maybe will reinforce that like, wait, I can be gone for 5 minutes and it's actually gonna be okay. And so maybe we can build on that and feel more comfortable in taking those breaks. Allowing space for grief, I think Madeline talked about this really nicely, and grief is such a part of this journey from start to finish, right? Grief for the parts of our identity that maybe we don't get to nurture as much as we do. And again, just kind of an overall mindfulness and an allowance to feel that way. Being intentional with asking for what you need. I was reading an article about grief after the loss of a loved one, and how everybody in their network brought over a meal. And they were just so annoyed with continuing to get food. And they're like, if somebody brings me another frozen lasagna, like I'm gonna lose it. And so it just is like a reminder of sometimes we don't know what to say, right? Like, I don't know if you've had a friend, or like whatever the situation is, sometimes we're at a loss for words, right? Like we want to be there for somebody, but we don't know what to say. And I think a lot of times in our community, right, like people on the outside don't know what to say to us. They don't know what to do for us. And so if you can be intentional with asking for what you need, sometimes that's really helpful for people. And they'll probably be able to step up and do that for you. And lastly, the giving ourselves grace. Like this is the thing that comes to mind again with like the pressure that we feel to make the right choice, right? Or, oh my gosh, I messed this up. Or, my loved one, they got hurt because of like a hazard at the house that I didn't think of. And we take on a lot of blame and we take on a lot of guilt. And what I encourage folks to do is really give yourselves grace. Because again, if we think about, our larger puzzle image, we are still just a person with these pieces ourselves, and we're trying to keep all of it together, and we need to give ourselves some kindness to make those mistakes. All right, I think it's back to Madeline.
So we're going to both come up the end for any questions, but real quick, I'm going to go through just a couple other sort of ways to cope, right? How to manage things. So exercise, I'm sure no one's heard of this. I think this is probably one of the most common things that we can do, whether it's just a little bit. Pick something you like to do and then do it, even when you don't feel like doing it. Because sometimes when we start doing it, then we get that, oh yeah, actually that felt so good. I'm so glad I went and did it, right? And I think that's a really important one. So volunteer. I have a family member who suffers from anxiety and depression, and she's incredible. She's just an amazing person. She's constantly volunteering. And I remember talking to her about it one time, and she said, sometimes when I just get too inside myself, I just have to step outside. And, I think as caregivers, volunteering is really hard because we're like, I'm already doing this all the time, right? But do something really different, right? Don't volunteer with Huntington's. Go volunteer somewhere else and step outside and, see the need. I had a friend after college who got divorced, and she had a lot of guilt and shame around the divorce and was just really struggling. And we had gone out and done something and met some new people. And one of the gals that we met was also divorced and had 10 kids under the age of 12, 3 sets of twins, was a single parent. Her husband had just left and disappeared. It was just this crazy story. And I remember my friend said, that has really put my life in perspective for me. And so sometimes there's always somebody with a worse story. And sometimes getting out there and serving helps us see there's other people with other things going on, right? And it just helps shift our perspective and make our load a little lighter sometimes. Participate in research. I think I love the Enroll study. It's such an incredible thing. It's just an annual thing, but all of my folks that are in the Enroll study just show a lot of pride, and they're always like, oh, I'm in Enroll. And it's just something that makes you feel good, and you can be in Enroll as a family member, at risk or gene positive. Your status can be completely unknown. You can go as the spouse of somebody, right? So the Enroll study is really open. There's a lot of places that have it, and but I think there's so much great research out there, and participating is something that can give us well, I'm making a difference, right? I'm doing something. I loved the numbers from last night from the opening ceremony, how many people gave blood last year. I was dying. I'm like, really? In 2 days? I'm like, those nurses must have been busy, So it's just so great. I know that our community is a community of participation. And that many of you are probably already involved in research, but it really can be something I think that gives you meaning. Mental health self-care, like I said, this is something that it's really easy to not be aware of till somebody else tells us, right? But taking a look at it, I'm somebody, I do not like to be cold, and I do not like snow, and I live in Colorado. And I used to live in Utah, and both are very cold, snowy places. And so I basically have a rule that every January, February-ish, I go somewhere really warm for at least a week. Because I know that for me, that is good self-care, right? And when I married my husband, I was like, this is just how it is. And I can go with or without you. It's totally fine, But I think it's so important that we recognize what we need, right? Our mental health is really important. If I don't have good mental health, I can't take care of anyone else. And as a social worker, I always tell people that, and I'm like, you have to, as a caregiver, take care of yourself first. Because otherwise you don't have the capacity, to care for others in the way that they deserve or that you would like to, I think. Sometimes I think not being afraid of mental health, not being afraid to say, oh, I'm really anxious or I'm really depressed or, gosh, I'm just really struggling with these repeated thoughts. These are weird, right? I had a client that I was working with who had been sent to see me because he was really suicidal. And it turns out he wasn't suicidal. He had intrusive thoughts about dying, right? And so he would get by a cliff and he would think, oh, I should jump. Well, that's not suicide necessarily. He didn't want to die at all. In fact, I found out during COVID that he was terrified of dying, right? But his intrusive thoughts were so intense that he thought he was suicidal. And so sometimes it's not what we think it is. Sometimes we really have to just step back and go talk to somebody about it, get some insight. Take a look at what is going on for me. Is this manageable? Is there something I could do about it that would just make it so much better, so much easier, right? And then this one, practice patience. Be patient with yourselves. Start there. Be kind to yourself. I loved what Courtney said, about being a caregiver and just that idea of you're probably did I do the right thing? You totally did. you did everything you knew to do. It was the right thing, right? And I think I'm someone, I have a lot of internal confidence that I was born with. So my mom asked me where I got it from. I thought that was funny. I was like, I don't know, Mom, I've just always been that way. But in my mind, you know, most of the time, I have a very red personality, and of course I did the right thing. You know, I don't doubt myself hardly ever, right? But I know that most people aren't like that. And I think but it's important in some ways to just be like, well, I did the best I could. Right? And you guys might have heard, I did the best I could with what I had at the time, right? And I think just going back to that, you know, looking back, I'm like, probably should have said no, but you know what? I said yes because at the time, yes felt right. And just remembering that feeling, right? And kind of bringing that feeling back in. I think too, try to be kind to others. Like in my mind, if we're coming from a place of love, and we're making those decisions based on our care for someone, we really are making good decisions. And we can't know the outcomes of something. I had somebody, they went ahead and put a feeding tube in, and it was somebody that was nonverbal, and they had felt like that was that person's decision, and it turned out really badly that it didn't take. I think the client pulled it out, and it was really an awful situation. And my caregiver said, "Oh, Madeline, I wished I'd never done that." And I said, "Sure, but you didn't know that when you did it." I said, "Why did you do it?" She said, "Well, because we wanted to help him. He was starving and choking." And I said, "Well, there you go. You did it with a good intention, and you didn't know the outcome, and you did everything you could to be a good person, right?" And she's like, "Right." And I said, "Then you should feel good about yourself, right?" And I think that's one of the things is that sometimes we can never meet the needs of others, but we can do our best, and we can feel good about doing our best, right? No matter what the outcomes are. So, intentional time with others. Courtney talked about your people. Find your people, right? In fact, I was thinking about this as I looked around the room. I know a couple of you, and I want you guys to introduce yourself to somebody after this, because everybody that's here is here because they feel like the lone caregiver in a sea of people that don't get me. You know what I mean? Everybody's here because they want the connection. They want to meet somebody that's like them. Caregivers who are at-risk and gene positive are not super common in my chapter. There's not a lot of them, right? And I think it's just so nice to be in a room where many of you fit that. And so make a friend today. Find somebody that you can email or text or Snapchat or whatever over the next year and be like, how's it going? It's so important to have that kind of support. And then connecting with nature. So there was actually a study done recently that 30 minutes in the woods could decrease depression by 80%. And I heard this last year. I think it was done by Harvard. It was either Harvard or Stanford or one of those big ERDs, And it was funny because my girls go to a camp up in the mountains, and we'd gone up to plan a scavenger hunt. And I told them this, and they said, "Oh, I believe that. Every time I go to camp, I feel so much happier. I feel so much better." And getting out in nature, it's fun. I came down a few days early, and we walked around some neighborhoods, and a lot of them don't have yards. They don't have anything, it's just, but they have trees and bushes and plants everywhere, like on their balconies and around their car. There was this one, and it had just this little tiny car spot behind a grill, and you could just see plants everywhere, and I thought, oh, I bet they park the car on the street and put their chairs and tables out there and have their barbecues, and it's really fun. So I think, connecting with nature, finding something beautiful to look at, somewhere beautiful to go, something that you love and enjoy, right? Being outside, breathing fresh air if there is somewhere you are, even a rooftop, something like that. So, and then the last one is spirituality. And, whether your spirituality is a higher power, connecting with something outside of yourself, recognizing that there is something. And I know for a lot of people, spirituality is something that helps them keep moving forward. I had a gentleman share with me that he and his dad were both fairly religious people, and his dad had Huntington's, and they memorized some scriptures together that they felt like really applied to what they were experiencing. And as his dad got sicker and was kind of unable to do some of those things, he said, every time I would review that, I would think about my dad and the connection that we had made, and I would feel comforted. So whatever your spiritual routine is, whether it's yoga, right, meditation, prayer, sitting in nature, any kind of practice, I think that connecting with our inner core, right, like really getting a sense of ourself. In one of the therapies I do, it talks about our soul as being unwoundable. And I think about that a lot because I'm like, there is a part of us that is unwoundable. It may have existed before we were born and may continue to exist after we die. And if we can connect with that part of ourselves through whatever desire or practice, we have an opportunity to feel a sense of connectedness, right? No aversions, no desires. It's not a selfish part of self, right? And I think that, as we kind of get into that place, we can feel unconditional, effortless acceptance and loving kindness for ourselves and for others, right? It doesn't have to be just for everyone else. A sense of interconnectedness and completeness and wholeness. And so I want you guys to maybe just kind of think about a time possibly out in nature or during some meditation when you felt those things, and think about what that felt like and see if you can breathe into that or recreate that experience or bring that back into yourself, right? There are some spaces in us where we can feel whole even when life is hard. And to me, I think that's what that spiritual piece is about, is like connecting to who we are. So it's not a feel-good state of mind, right? It's sort of a transcendent state of mind. So I'm going to invite Courtney to come back up, and we're going to answer any questions that anybody might have. So please, if you want to scan the QR code and give us some feedback, we would love that. And we're so glad that you were all here today. So.
Yeah. Virtual caregiving support groups? Yeah, so if you're not familiar, HDSA actually offers online support groups. Oh, yeah. I know the one I host is usually the fourth Tuesday of every month, so there might be a second caregiver one that happens in the month, but I know mine is usually the fourth Tuesday, with the exception of June, because I'll be gone on Hay Piers, yeah. Yep. So if you're not familiar, so HDSA, if you go to the HDSA website, one of the toggles that they have for support is for their online support groups, and they actually have different focus groups. One of them is a caregiver support group. They have an at-risk gene positive support group. They have one for folks who are symptomatic. So we've been really intentional with trying to create a lot of different focus groups to kind of fit the needs of the community. So if you're not familiar with that resource, take a look at the HDSA website. It runs through the Hay Piers platform, which has been a little bit trickier for people to navigate than when they ran through Zoom. But you can just register, and then you log in at the time of the group, and we're there.
So I run the second Thursday group. It's for at-risk and gene positive. So not specifically caregivers, but we can talk about any issues. And then Courtney's is at the end of the month for caregivers. And that can also be at-risk or gene positive caregivers. It can be any kind of caregiver. So.
You don't have to pass any test to see if you can stay in the group. So any other questions? Or does anybody have anything that they would add to the slides? I know a lot of what Madeline offered was feedback that she got from folks in her support group. Does anybody else have other, I'm going to keep going with my puzzle, and maybe that's something that will stick with you too, because I really like that image, right? We need our pieces to fit. Does anybody else have any other suggestions for things that kind of help bring them back to thinking of, yeah.
One thing we encourage family members or caregivers to do is expand their circle a little bit. Someone who can say, on the first Wednesday of the month, I'll pick your person up and they go to lunch. And it's just kind of a standing thing.
Yeah.
On the second Wednesday of the month, we'll go to a movie.
So the comment is, Yeah, so the comment is that she encourages families to expand their circle, and that makes me think of that like being intentional with asking for what you need. And her suggestion is kind of creating like a schedule, like a calendar of events to kind of build that time for yourself by asking people who like, what can I do? Well, on Wednesday, can you come pick up my loved one and take them out for a drive? Or so, having a couple things scheduled, and, sometimes that feels overwhelming. Like, I can't believe I have to coordinate one more thing. But if you think about kind of the larger puzzle and we're trying to get those pieces to all fit in the same, in the same jigsaw, then asking for those things and having people on the agenda. And it helps too if your loved one has a lot of apathy, right? Like people with apathy aren't going to seek those things out. Yeah. The question was about how to maybe encourage re-engagement into the HD community after maybe a family member or caregiver got maybe burnout, and then after the loss of a loved one has kind of just checked out. I think the thing that comes to mind is that for some people that's a coping skill, and sometimes I like what Madeline said, of coping skills serve a purpose for a certain amount of time. So one thing I would consider is this still an appropriate coping skill for my mom? Like, is this something she still needs because so much of herself was put into this? And then the other thing I think about, and I talk about this in caregiver groups, is sometimes we can talk about Huntington's disease without having to use the words Huntington's disease in everything that we say, right? And so sometimes when we can talk about common experiences or concerns and not have to constantly be throwing out Huntington's disease in the verbiage that we're using, that can kind of create a more welcoming space to think about these things. So I talk about that a lot when we have loved ones with symptoms and they're not willing to acknowledge or think about or go get help for them. Can we talk about them in a way where we're not hammering Huntington's disease at them? So that would be one thing that comes to mind. I don't know. Okay. Okay. If you don't mind, if you haven't done it, I don't know where all this feedback goes, but take a picture. They really embrace those QR codes this year. So leave some feedback. We really appreciate it. Thanks for spending your time with us. I think lunch is next. Okay. Thanks, everybody.